Hey everyone, I'm Ari here with Rachel, and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. This week we're on episode 275 asking who is Andrew McDowell. Before we start, if you enjoy the show, consider checking out our Ko-fi page. You can follow the page for free as we have plenty of goodies for all. If you're feeling generous, you can become a Merry Writer for $2 a month. You'll help keep the show going and also have access to bonus episodes and exclusive shop items. If that's not your style, but you still enjoy the podcast, please then subscribe wherever you're listening if you haven't already.
Now, this week, we have a special guest joining us again on the show. Some of you might be familiar with him. Andrew, welcome back to the podcast. For those of you who don't know, Andrew is a returning guest. It's been a long time since we've chatted. Andrew's previous episode was number 23, which was all the way back in September 2020. We will link to that episode in the description below, but before you go give that a listen, let's get to know Andrew and his work. Andrew, please introduce yourself to our listeners, and before we get to the main questions, you can tell us how long you've been writing.
Thank you, Rachel and Ari, and thanks again for having me here on this podcast today. So yeah, it's been a long time. And in fact, I think this was the subject of my original episode. I believe it was when did I know I wanted to be a writer? Well, for those who didn't hear the last one, I started writing little stories for fun when I was around age 11, actually, but it wasn't until I turned 13 when I really got serious, and that's when I actually began writing what would eventually become my first book. I just started writing longhand, actually, if you can believe that, because at that time I hadn't successfully yet learned to type, and it would take until my freshman year, a year later, when I took a keyboarding class. That's what helped me type. So yeah, if we've got anybody here who's going into high school or whatever, if they offer a keyboarding class and you don't know how to type, take that class. But as I wrote more and more, and because I can still remember doing it like late at night at the dinner table after dinner, and my hand got tired, and of course being left-handed, I got graphite stains on it. As I just got more invested into the story, I knew then there was no turning back and that I was seriously going to pursue writing for the rest of my life. And so to put it all in perspective, this upcoming August, I'm going to turn 35. So roughly I've been a writer for 24 years.
Wow. So you and I started writing around the same time, because I was 10 when I started writing. And I definitely agree with Andrew. If your school offers a typing class, definitely take it, because everything's digital now. So you got to learn that skill, even though I took the class and I still don't type correctly, but that's a whole other story.
I get that because I'm self-taught typist because I started typing before they did lots of classes in like computer skills because I typed on a typewriter. And when you're 10, 11, 12 and you only have a typewriter, you learn your own way. And it's hard to unlearn that to learn a correct one. So yeah, definitely do that. I too used to write in longhand before I was allowed to use the typewriter. And it does give you really bad cramp in your hand, especially if your brain is giving you the story so fast that your hand can barely keep up. That was one of the reasons why I was so happy to move to digital when I could, because it was just not quick enough. All the ideas were coming, and then if I didn't get it down in time, I'd lose them. So yeah, definitely get typing if you can.
You're right about that. When I first started longhand, it was very linear where I would write one chapter at a time, but now it's kind of a bit haphazard. And I guess I can blame technology for that, for bringing me into an age, where we have to rush so much.
Okay, let's go on to our official questions. What does your writing process currently look like? Because obviously writing processes do change over time.
It's like assembling a puzzle together, or if you want to go the gruesome imagery route, it's like assembling a Frankenstein monster. So yeah, bits come to me, I try fleshing them out, and that helps, when you have writer's block on a scene and you're not sure how it's going to work. So, and yeah, then I try to figure out how to stitch them all together. So yeah, it works easier when I have a hole I can't fill, and so I fill the others first. But still, I think it would be nice to write again from front to end. I kind of miss that in a way, and I'm learning, especially in this day and age of technology, you really need to learn to slow down rather than rush. Because I think some of you touched on that, how like when you're typing, you can still miss stuff. And oh boy, I'm guilty of that, like maybe 200% or more.
No, I have to say my writing style is very similar. It's very patchwork quilt. You start with the big scenes and you kind of grow outwards. I have never managed to write front to back. I'm actually a little bit jealous of writers who can do that. And I've known a few who started that way and then moved away to more patchwork quilty, and then other way where people started very hodgepodge and then went front to back. So when you're fleshing out your story, how do you find you ask yourself questions, or do you just look at what you've got and then kind of work threadwise to find out, right, well, if this is how I start, how do I move on the next steps? Is that how you fill your holes, or is it completely different?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, but it is a bit of both too. because I see what I have, especially if I have a question where I realize I have a question I'm trying to fill, and then I try to work it in my mind. How do I do it together? I think the most recent addition to my writing process now, and which I hope to use more in the editing in the future, is I've discovered Microsoft Word's read aloud feature. And I think I just only wish I had done that better. I wish I had learned that about that long before. Yeah, I think that helps me hear it out loud, and it catches things, because once again I'm editing my books, trying to catch stuff. So it's a tremendous help.
It is. It's a huge help to read your work out loud and be able to hear it back and read along. That's how I edit. I usually narrate. Once my book is done, I narrate it and then I listen back to it as I read it, just for that final proofread in a way. And it's a tremendous help. It's so funny how the two of you write like in a scattered way. I was never able to do that. I always had to be from start to finish. And if I have an idea, I need to write it down separately. It can't go in the middle of what I'm working on because it bothers me. It looks like, you know how when you work on a jigsaw puzzle, you get the border edges and then you fill in the middle. I gotta have all those middle pieces off to the side and then I add it in as I go.
That always seems really weird to me. It's like, no, you have to just shove those scenes in and then build outwards. Yeah, just it needs to be that. I have to say, I completely forgot about the read aloud feature. I remember finding it, I think a year or two ago, and I even wrote a blog post about it because I used it a few times, and I kept thinking, this is great, this is what I'm going to use. And I have completely forgotten about it until you mentioned it. And I know I write in Scrivener, but I do compile into Word, and that would actually be good because I know if I read my work out loud myself, I would miss the same things, and just like if I missed a word, I would just fill it in automatically, and I wouldn't notice I'd missed it. But I think hearing it back via an app would probably be better. So thank you for reminding me that. I'm going to make a note to use that because I have forgotten.
I don't use Microsoft Word, so I'm sure that is useful, Ari. You'll have to talk about that another time. But let's get to know Andrew's work a little more. Your One with Nature series is fantasy. What drew you to that genre?
Well, believe it or not, when I first started that longhand draft, I was not intending to write in fantasy. I was actually trying to go with a horror idea. But as time went on, as I was writing it gradually, sooner or later at some point I realized, and it might have been before I switched to typing, or maybe it was in between that process, I realized it was leaning more towards like the fantasy hero's journey, as spelled out by Joseph Campbell's famous book, Hero with a Thousand Faces. So I just decided, if that's where it's going, I'm just going to go with the flow, thinking maybe I'd save horror, for another project, and I might explore that again someday. But yeah, I realized it was going towards fantasy and that I had to just let it go that way. But certainly, to answer your original question, what draws me to that genre, I've always enjoyed fantasy and the idea of knights in shining armor, dragons, magic. There's always been a great appeal to that. And yeah, it wasn't too hard to switch to that genre.
I appreciate that you said you just went with the flow. Your brain, you had the idea of one thing, and your brain and your creativity and your thoughts said something else, and you were like, you know what? If this story was meant to be a fantasy, then it'll be a fantasy. Is horror your favorite genre, or have you found like a new appreciation for fantasy now that you write fantasy?
Truth be told, I don't think I've ever had a favorite genre, because I've read and watched things from so many different genres, and I guess that's the sort of person I am. I'm drawn to many things, and as a writer, I want to explore many different genres and try my hand, because I think that'll keep me from falling back into the same thing over and over. Though I will admit, certainly other stories like little plot lines, I think I have fallen into the trap of doing the same thing. So, but certainly, yeah, I think writing fantasy certainly made me appreciate it a little bit more. But yeah, it was fun to try, and I hope to definitely expand my horizons.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about just being a writer. I know a lot of people say that you should write in one genre and stick to it if you want to, dominate that market and stuff. But I really appreciate it when authors write in multiple genres and they explore those different sides of their creativity, because it's all wonderful. And if you like many different things, you should be able to explore that. And I like that you allow yourself to just go with the flow, as you said, and you just work on whatever you want, and that's great.
Yeah, I actually like that because to me, the more different genres you try, the more information you pull in. So let's take horror, like you mentioned. If you want to write horror and you try your hand at horror and you kind of learn the different tropes and the feelings of writing that, you can then take that kind of, it's supposed to be like scary, it's supposed to make the reader feel on edge, feel nervous, feel terrified. You can then take those aspects that you've learned and put them in a historical drama that you write. Same with if you write romance, you can then put it into an action story with a hint of romance. So yeah, I think touching in several different ones is good. And I know they do say that, don't they? Oh, stick with one. It's like, you can be the king of horror or the queen of fantasy. It's like, I appreciate why people do that, but I'm the same. I like it when I find my favorite author has books that are contemporary and then books that are traditional and then ones that are, completely different. Maybe they'll write a YA, maybe they'll write a pirate story, maybe they'll write a historical fiction. And it kind of lets me see their voice in all these different places. And I think it's really useful for writers to be curious, even if you decided, you know what, I'm going to write horror for myself, or I'm going to write thriller, and I won't publish them. It can still be such a good thing to try. And I do actually think writers should try different genres, even if they don't publish everything, because I think you can learn a lot from it.
Yeah, you bring up some good points because really writing in different genres and different formats and stuff really helps you figure out your writing voice. And obviously, yeah, every novel you read has some sort of subgenre in it because a lot of them have romantic subplots and things like that. So yeah, that's a really good point.
We're still talking about your work in general. So what inspired you to actually write this series particularly?
Well, I mean, after I decided that I was going to go with the flow in terms of making it a fantasy story, so obviously I needed to rethink it a bit to make it more fantasy. And when I started doing that, my first goal was to try to find a theme that would give it a meaning and make it stand out and something special. So I eventually settled on focusing with natural magic because as a kid I always loved learning about wild animals and about nature. Like I watched those sort of programs like when I was a kid and read books, learning facts. I just loved reading about animals. Yes, the idea of natural magic struck a chord, so I did more research into connecting with the natural world and magic and that sort of thing. And so, yes, the story eventually became what it is. And that led me to do some research about like Celtic and Druidism, that sort of thing. And yeah, it took several rewrites, but yeah, it eventually became a story focused on magic that connects with nature and about appreciating the natural world more. Yeah, believe it or not, in a way, that sort of theme actually has led some people to label it as literary fiction as well, which you wouldn't normally hear I guess with genre fiction, you wouldn't normally think of. But yeah, I think it is possible. Literary fiction and genre fiction can be blended.
When I read it, I remember there was the strong nature themes, and obviously even just the names had that very Celtic-y feel to them with your characters. And I remember, I think it was one of the first books I'd read in ages that had griffins in it. It's because it's like I always love fantasy and I love nature and I love that sort of magic kind of style. And I like it when people put mythologies in there and put like creatures in there. And obviously we always have dragons and we always have like mermaids and everything. So it's always nice when there's like other creatures in. And again with the magic, you don't always get that sort of more natural magic. It's often the almost like superhero type of magic in books. So that's kind of a nice theme that feels from it. And I had another point, but it's completely gone out of my head. So, Rachel, carry on in case I remember.
Actually, before you do that, I'd like to respond to what you said about, the creatures and you said griffins, because that was another choice on my part to try to make it stand out more, because the ones I had read, dragons certainly are always a big one. And of course, I've always loved dragons. Same with unicorns are another one. So I wanted a mythical creature that I thought was a little more unique. And yes, I chose griffins because after reading the Harry Potter book, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, I remember. For some reason, I always kept returning to the description of the griffin because something struck a chord with me, much in the same way dragons and unicorns did. And believe it or not, I had more mythical creatures in there, but I realized I was overcrowding it. So yes, I had to cut a few of them out. But those three were the ones that remained, at least in the first book. And then in Beneath the Deep Wave, I was able to add a couple more in.
Well, see, I think that's what makes it so great is because you have real interest and passion in those creatures, and it really translates on the page when you're reading the book. And I just want to touch upon the whole literary fiction thing for a minute. And I think that's like genre fiction and literary fiction can be blended together because, especially when the themes and the content of the fictional story is so real and it's based off of like real things. I know mythology, you can argue technically is not real, but it's real to the people who believe in it. And I think having that string, that like invisible string that ties into the real world can really just make the whole book really pop, and it'll help people remember it, and it just ties into the real world so great like that. And I think nature in general is an excellent way to do that.
Yeah, do it. I love things like that. And I have to be a little saddened to hear that you cut some other mythical creatures. Can you tell us what mythical creatures you had in book one that you took away?
Okay, well, perhaps because, Lord of the Rings was on my end, I had elves, dwarves, and centaurs, and I think at one point even mermaids. So, but yeah, I was overcrowding, and I realized I had to go, so I tried to think of which ones were the most important, and also which ones I think I could connect with that nature theme a little bit better. So, but a different, so one of the creatures I did introduce in Beneath the Deep Wave is kind of similar to merfolk, and someone actually at work actually brought them to my attention. They're called selkies.
See, that's another one. Selkies, they're often not mentioned. See, I know my myths. I love mythologies. When I was little, I had books on the mythical animals, and that's why I really liked it when I saw Griffin, because you were right. Very little had griffins in, and I never watched the Harry Potter. I never read the books. I never watched the movies, so I was unaware that even they had it. But every book I'd read that talked about mythology or creatures that was fiction never mentioned griffins. And Selkies is another one. Was it Kelpies have started coming in? The water horse. But Selkies are still not mentioned very often, so that's a really cool one to have.
Well, I did include kelpies in the Beneath the Deep Wave as well, and I guess going back to griffins, I discovered actually when I read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, there's a griffin in there too, and that's where I got the spelling that I used from Alice in Wonderland. I thought it was more fantasy than the traditional spelling that is also a person's last name or first name, depending on who has it.
Well, speaking of your book and all the creatures in it, I do want to ask, if you could transport into your book's world, what would you visit first and who would you want to meet?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Certainly in my first book, there's so many forests to choose from, but I suppose I would start out with the one where the first mentor, Saoirse, lives in her little cottage. I guess she's one of the people I'd like to meet, along maybe even the wizard Yarworth too. So maybe her cottage first, and maybe second, the Ring of Stones, where they meet Yarworth for the first time. Because I was thinking, of Stonehenge and stone circles in the British Isles when I included that. Yeah, it's just Saoirse and Yarworth and their knowledge of the natural world is what I find inspiring, because I see my protagonist, Dermot, as kind of like the nature lover in me.
I have to say, yeah, in Britain, we do love our stone circles. They're everywhere. Everyone knows about Stonehenge, but they are dotted all over the place. We have so many of them. And it's weird. Even the small ones, you'll find them in random fields, the tractor going around and everything. And they're quite a mystical feeling when you go to them. Even the smaller ones where there's just like regular sized stones rather than the giant monoliths you get in Stonehenge. So yeah, the things like that. That's always kind of a nice pull to people, especially if you're like reading a book with things like that. And it can almost give you an interest in learning more about the natural world, mythology, things like the Celtics and the Druids, and like the connection to standing stones and everything. So yeah, I really like that.
You just explained what I was trying to explain earlier so much better. Because that's why I was saying it's so important to have that tied to the real world, because it allows people to explore that further, whether it's, in fiction or reality.
It's actually interesting because things like that, when you have little pieces that have a connection that you can sort of relate to the natural world, it's kind of good because you can actually use them in marketing tactics and things like that. So with that, what marketing tactics can you share that worked well for you for your books?
Well, to tell you the truth, that might be like a whole nother story and perhaps a podcast in itself. So, but I'll try to sum them up as best I can. Certainly, I think when all else fails, word of mouth is always the best way to tell people about your books, and I highly recommend that for any writer. So, tell people in person about it. And I learned it the hard way, you always want to have like business cards on you. That's enough. Or at least, if you can't write on scrap paper, always have carry business cards. In fact, I learned at one writers conference some years ago that, in fact, it's a great way to market your work is to go to the non-writing related social circles. So some in my case that have worked, I've approached people in the church I attend, and they've even put announcements about things like events in my books in their newsletter. Yeah, if places like that are willing to help you out, go for it. Yeah, and my Masonic Lodge too. So for those who don't know, I'm a Freemason. So yeah, my brothers have bought my books, and certainly my family too. If your family is willing to read and review, definitely tell them. And yeah, in fact, I think the same author who talked about that sort of thing said she even, I guess, was able to market it when she was getting her hair cut with her barber. So any opportunity, any opportunity for conversation, bring up your book somehow. That's great, but also don't force it. If they're not interested, don't push it on them. And definitely those in-person events like conferences and book signings are great to do. I mean, I joined the Maryland Writers Association years ago before I was published, and that was a great way to network and meet other writers and meet publishers and so forth. And I've attended their conference every year, and I'm hoping to go back this October. So that'll be an opportunity for a book signing. And well, certainly if any event where I can, sell a couple of copies of book is always pretty much a guarantee to bring me back. So in fact, this upcoming weekend when we're recording this, I'm going to go back to a fantasy sci-fi convention for the second time called Balticon. Anybody who's in the Baltimore area or close by and you love fantasy and sci-fi is something to check out. And also this upcoming August, for the first time, I'm going to be doing one at the Maryland Renaissance Festival, a place where I always went as a kid and loved it. And in fact, that also kind of helped, fuel that love of fantasy and the medieval. So as for going online, well, you can use it, though. Always bear in mind that social media and so forth is really like a hit or a miss. Sometimes you'll make that connection and sometimes you won't. And that has been quite a ride for me. I mean, I started out with Facebook, and then, of course, I made my website and blog, so I've used my blog to promote it as well and share it on social media. And for a while there, I went on social media big time during the pandemic. I know some writers focused more on their writing, I focused more on my marketing. And during that time, in fact, Twitter, it seemed like, was a really big help where, I would do all those participate in all those shameless self-promos and comment my book. And so after a while, it felt like I was losing the connection and it was just eating up too much of my time. So I had to rethink my use of social media and try to limit myself because it felt more like a distraction and an addiction. Yeah, I left Twitter, and another one I left was Tumblr because it felt like I wasn't getting enough attention there, or at least not a lot of reactions. And that was actually before Twitter became X, by the way. So after it became X, I tried both of them again, but that was very brief. Tumblr, again, no reaction, and X now, every time I tried to market it, it kept spamming me, so I left them both again. Now I've kind of rediscovered the pattern of what I used to do on Twitter, and when it was called Twitter, on Blue Sky, which I went on after many of my fellow connections at the MWA, Maryland Writers Association, were making that migration from X to Blue Sky. So now what I do on Blue Sky, and which has worked from time to time, again, hit or miss, I will do manual searches for their version of tweets. I think I can't verify this, but I think they're called skeets. So I will look for ones where people are asking, for book recommendations or book recs in fantasy. And again, this is something you have to be very careful with. If you're going to do this like I do, make sure you read them carefully, because sometimes they will say they don't love fantasy or it's something else entirely. So read carefully if they're looking for fantasy. And I will comment, I've written these books by these titles, though very rarely I will share the link now as a way to avoid being, marked as spam. But yeah, sometimes they respond and sometimes they don't. So yeah. And I've done ads too, with Facebook and Amazon, though those not always the best success. Especially it seems like with Amazon ads, if you're going to do those, be very careful where and when you do them, I think. So certain times of the year are probably better. Winter holidays are probably the one time of year where it's probably the safest to run those ads, because that's when people are buying.
I like how you mentioned the in-person, because I think a lot of authors we've talked to, they often mention, oh yeah, websites and social media, and it always feels like very similar advice. And it isn't often mentioned about in-person. And it might be because a lot of us writers are very introverted and we don't always feel comfortable talking about it. But I think you're right. I think we could miss a trick if we don't learn to sort of even just a little bit, whether it's, as you said, business cards, which, by the way, I never even think of that. Whenever I hear business card, I think, oh yeah, a normal business. And it's well, it's still a business. Being a writer is still a business. If you have a product that you've created and you are charging for, it's a business. And having those that, even if you're not in the mood to talk, you could put some on the edge of the library counter, or you could slip some in books, or when you're at a cafe and you've put your tip in and you can just slide it underneath, so you don't even have to talk. But I like the idea that you mentioned it, you talked to your church about it, and then they in turn put it in the newsletter, so it went out even further. And then just, the writer who talked about it to the hairdresser, because it's that sort of thing. If someone's like, oh, so what do you do? It's a nice opener to just, I'm a writer. Because almost every time someone says that, the next response is, oh, what have you written? And then if you can just like whip out a business card or a bit of like a bookmark or something, or just be able to talk about your book. And I think so many writers shy away from that. And I say that as someone who would probably struggle myself, but I am aware that because the internet isn't as good, because social media doesn't have the same impact, they keep messing with the algorithms. You don't even get shown to your own followers most of the time. The idea of having that kind of connection with a real person, I bet that has a bigger impact than some of the internet stuff, because as I said, like social media, it goes, if you're lucky, it lasts 24 hours before it gets shunted down the pack. And so much of social media looks very similar to everything else. So you'll see something and you'll see 50 more posts that look identical, just with a different book cover in the middle. Whereas if you're personally talking to someone, you're making that human connection, that has got to be a strong marketing tactic. And it just isn't mentioned very often.
Yeah, and I will say the first time I went to a Maryland Writers Conference and had books, to sign, I made the mistake of not having the cards, and that was my advice, because I've learned people who, are interested in your book may not always want to buy it at that moment, but the business card is a way they can remember later on, and they can always buy it at some other place. And yeah, certainly with social media, I continued to try to narrow it down. I started out trying to limit it to a certain number of times a day, and now I've gotten a lot of them successfully, I think, down to just one day a week for some of them. So like Facebook and Blue Sky, just one day a week now, pretty much. And I think I'm starting to feel better for it.
I think that's great, because social media can really suck the life out of us, whether it's for business or for pleasure. It can really create that mental health toll. So, I mean, with that said, I do wonder, do you prefer marketing your books in person or online, whether it's social media or blog posts or whatever?
It's still a mixture of both for me, because, those in person, it can be hit and miss too, especially, in the conversation, because sometimes it may not be easy to bring it up, especially because, yes, I'm one of those introverted authors, and more so because I'm actually autistic. So I try to do the events when I can, but not to do too many, to not strain myself, because if you're always doing too many, that can take a toll, but probably maybe not as much as social media, I would imagine. But yeah, now that I'm limiting my time on social media, I've also learned that it's better to post less, because boy, during the pandemic, when I got on it so much, I was just sharing out the gazoo, and yeah, I really regret doing that, because the more you post, the less likely people are going to see them. So I try to be more deliberate now with what I share online. And yeah, I think getting the majority of them down to once a week, I think, has helped that a lot.
I think that's great that you found what works for you, and you just had that little bit of trial and error, and eventually you realized that you sort of find what works and what doesn't. And I do agree with you with everything, especially with the in-person and going to events and having the business cards, because I don't think I ever thought about having business cards for my writing either, which is funny because I've received business cards from authors before, but I never thought to do it myself. And I think having that human connection at different conferences and finding like-minded writers and in turn readers, that's all very solid advice. You gave a lot of good information. Thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome. So, and yeah, for the first time, I'm actually going to also have bookmarks at the Balticon from the upcoming weekend from when we're recording this. So we'll see if it's not as many as the cards, but we'll see people react to them. I mean, it's only a couple, but it's more like a test run this time.
That's fun. People love bookmarks, especially at writing conferences. So good luck with that. But speaking of your writing, do you have any new projects in the pipeline that you'd like to talk to us about?
I would say the main one right now is the final book in the fantasy trilogy, One with Nature. So, as I actually said on a guest post, and I forgot, this is another great thing to do for marketing online. If you follow other writers' blogs, and if they offer opportunities for guest posts and you think you can do it, go for it. That's another way to expand your marketing horizons. But yeah, as I said in a guest post I did a few months ago, once I write and publish this last book in the One with Nature trilogy, I'm not going to do any more with that world. So no more spin-offs or prequels or anything like that. No matter how much fans want it, I'm going to try to move on to other stuff after I finish this one. At the same time, I've got a few partially written things that I've had to put on the back burner now so I could focus more on that. So I don't want to go into too many details. I don't want to share or spoil away too much. But these include, I a partially written mystery thing involving, a missing pet that I started in a class back in my final year in college, actually. It's partially done, and I've attempted other things I actually attempted to write a play once about drawing on my experiences with my autism. I mean, that's like a partially written thing that's really on the back burner too, but we'll see if I ever get to that. And like I said, I want to try horror again and so many other genres. So like little ideas that are, some have, faded out, a few haven't. Hopefully I'll get to them, but I kind of learned I don't want to multitask on too many at once. So I think it's better to focus primarily on one at a time.
That's fair. I juggle too many projects at once, and I struggle with that because I have too many ideas. But I really enjoy how many ideas that you have and that you want to work on in the near future or the later future. I'll look forward to seeing what other work you come up with.
I like the fact that it wasn't just like novels. Like I know you've done poetry and everything, but now you've talked about script. So it's not even just that you're want to do multiple multi-genre. You're actually interested in doing different formats as well. And that's quite interesting because that'll definitely be something different that kind of, you have to draw on different wells of information and wells of experience when you're trying to do different things like that. And I also agree, yes, it can be really useful if you can focus intently on one series or one book or anything. And unfortunately, just like Rachel, I struggle with that. I like to hop around, and that's why I struggle to finish any of them. That's my issue. I think it was really good that what you said about how the series that you're working on, the one with nature series, you've got your book 3 that you're working on, and then that's your close. It doesn't matter if people say anything, you're not thinking of doing spin-offs. And I like the idea of that. I like it because I struggle with the, as soon as I start writing something, I'm like, oh, that would be a great side story. Oh, that would be a perfect mini story. And I have too many ideas of other things to be adding so much extra to my plate. So I like that you were able to sort of say to yourself, no, this is it. It is a self-contained 3 books. That is all you're getting. And that's what it is. And it kind of gives you the freedom then to move on to something else without being pulled back into that world. And sometimes you do need to kind of close the door on a piece of art or a piece of work that you're working on and say, no, I need to move on. So I do find that incredible. I wish I had that ability, and I need to be more like that because I can see myself falling down rabbit holes of new stories, and while the other projects waste away on the back burner. But yeah, no, I think that was really good.
Yeah, I would say, and this is something I guess I've always believed in for those who, don't want to do the same thing for their entire lives. And granted, I'm sure there are writers out there who would love to do that, who would love to stay with the same series or whatever. But yeah, if you don't want to do it your whole life, I would say make sure you have a fixed ending in mind, whether it be a certain number of books or like if it's a time frame that you're working out, like historical, for example, just choose the time when you're going to end and just stick with that.
That takes a lot of discipline. And I admire that. But I do agree with you that sometimes it gets to a point where, yeah, you need to find that ending. Because the mystery series I was working on, I have like 10 book ideas for that. I don't know if it'll ever reach 10 books, but it's one of those things that it's really hard to let go. And you need to find that, you got to draw that fine line at some point. So good for you with finding that stopping point and just putting your foot down and saying, nope, this is it. Their story is told. It's time to move on.
We might need a whole podcast where we talk about how to do that. We may have to pick your brains sometime, Andrew, and be like, give us more advice on how to tell people how to do that. Because I can imagine there's a few people out there who could do with the best way of like, this is how we stop. And I need that too.
Yeah, because I think, if you just keep on going and going, I mean, some people probably can do it, if they love it so much, but I imagine sooner or later, like the, in quotation marks, magic will probably fade, and it becomes a point where you run the risk of no longer doing it because you love the story, but you're just doing it because of the money, or, because people expect it. Yeah, I guess, it was an easy decision with fantasy because, so many of them have been trilogies and so forth, and it kind of fit well with the 3 phases, I think, as Joseph Campbell's hero's journey was divided into. So, yeah, I'm just glad I'm making that work.
I like trilogies because I know that there's people started doing like 4s and 5s. I think trilogy, if you can fit a story in a trilogy, it's a nice set rather than obviously, if you're doing a multiple book, like originally, 10, 12 books, whatever. But if it's a shorter one, I do duologies and trilogies have always been my favorite. Rachel, have you got anything else to add before we move on to our final secret question? That's not really a secret if you've listened to any of our recent episodes. Yeah, you're fine. Okay. Andrew, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, especially for me because I sadly missed your episode back in 2020. So this is the first time we've actually been able to talk to each other properly. We do have one final last quick question. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Damn it, I am losing this. Oh,
Thank you. You are, and it's great.
I think we were drawn. So great. Thanks for that, Andrew. You're not allowed on again for picking the wrong one. No, obviously, of course, that's not what I mean. You'll pick tea next time, though, right?
I'm not adverse to trying tea. I've tried it a few times. Yeah, it's just, I drink coffee every morning, so that's kind of why I had to choose it.
And that's the way to do it.
These coffee drinkers. To be fair, though, you Americans, don't you all have iced tea? Is that your tea? Because that's just weird. Iced tea is just weird. I'm going to say it.
I don't like iced tea.
I don't really drink it either.
Yucky.
It's not really tea. I don't think it's right. It's like saying warm ice cream. Nobody wants warm ice cream. Anyway, before I go down a rabbit hole complaining about tea and coffee, Andrew, before we go, please let our listeners know like where to find you, where to check out your books, all that, or just share a bit about yourself.
So yes, I've written 2 fantasy novels so far, Mystical Greenwood and Beneath the Deep Wave, and the former has won a few awards. I've been a finalist for a few others as well, like honorable mentions. Yeah, I've been writing since I was a teenager, and I went to St. Mary's College of Maryland and College Park, and besides my books, I've written and published poetry, short stories, and essays in quite a few anthologies and literary journals, and I have links to all of my published work on my website, andrewmcdowellauthor.com, so that's my main online hub where you can find out more about me and my work, and if you want to follow me on social media, I've got links there too for my Facebook page, my Blue Sky profile, and also my YouTube channel, and you can also follow me on Goodreads and Amazon.
Thank you for that, and obviously for joining us again. All of Andrew's links will be in the description below, website and social media, so do please go and check out his work. Now we'll turn it over to you guys. Please do give Andrew a shout out in our comments and let them know what you think of his work and anything else. And also, feel free to answer the tea coffee question, and maybe we'll get some more teas. Remember, we do release new episodes every Wednesday. Next week, we're discussing how to write the blurb for your novel. To ensure you don't miss it, hit the subscribe button on your way out. As always, thanks for listening to the Merite Podcast. We'll see you next week. This podcast is brought to you by Shiny Objects. We're easily distracted. The music titled Inspired is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.